should not be surprised the bank examiners would defer to banks in a way very unlike Mr. Nettlewick. Even in Segura's account is not representative in every aspect given the complexity of the modern banking and proximity that puts examiners into daily contact with the bankers. The examiners come to depend on the banks examined, both for information and for compliance. As one journalist who reported extensively on Segura's story said, as the examiners, they see bankers every day, and they need to obtain the information from these banks. It is easier to obtain the information if you're friendly and have a good relationship. That's not to say that the bank examiners need to be so icy and swift, so impersonal and uncompromising, but there is a very presence seems in the accusation, as the case with Mr. Nettlewick, but it does mean that such physical and ideological proximity can lead to the examiners to defer to bankers in a way that aren't consistent when they need to ensure the financial safety of regulatory compliance of the banks in question. In geography of the Fed power complexities and proximities of the bank supervision give private banks great control over Fed policy than the rest of the general public. Next subject, chapters afoot in bank supervision. There are signs that changes are afoot within the Fed Reserve system, the respect to the bank supervision, as discussed in Chapter 3. Fed Governor Daniel Tarullo has radically changed the way that the bank examiners are trained, recruited, and themselves supervised. While the Federal Reserve Act gives full legal authority to the Board of Governors for all matters regulatory and supervisory, the Fed has historically delegated much of that authority to the board staff and especially the reserve banks. In light of the reserve banks' structural proximity to commercial banks they supervise, the examiners' ability to keep a critical distance is arguably even more difficult. In 2010, however, it appears that the Board of Governors has worked to move the reserve banks increasingly out of the business of supervising the largest banks in the financial system. In a secret document called the Triangle Document, quotes, disclosed to select journalists in 2015 but written in 2010, the Fed revealed that the Reserve Bank delegation had largely come to an end with respect to the largest banks, especially at the New York Fed. It is difficult to determine whether the changes outlined in the Triangle Document are good or bad for our efforts to make the Fed more comprehensible and thus more accountable to outsiders. The changes are good because there is simply no theoretical justification of bank examination as part of a central sacred trust deposition deposited in an independent central bank in the Ulysses Punch Bowl sense of the world. Consider again, though, how the Fed decided to disclose the new policy, secret documents, code names, partial disclosures 5 years after the fact. It all seems so gracious, gratuitous. This kind of disclosure harms the banks supervised, since they may not have a clear sense of which institution within the Fed is calling the shots on a supervisory matter, and the same confusion makes it difficult for the public to supervise the Fed. Next subject, is there hope for conflict-free bank supervision? The foraging discussion leaves an open question. How should we build a supervisory system within the Federal Reserve to ensure the bank examiners conduct their job rigorously and fairly? This question is one of the most vexing public policy issues in finance. Even the seemingly obvious solutions aren't clear. For example, some scholars and economists argue that the pay is the problem. Bankers are paid too much, bank supervisors too little. The allocation of talent and attention with those kinds of wage signals is pretty clear. All else equal, more social resources, including talent and education, will go toward hiring bankers and lawyers who will help banks skirt the demands of supervision, rather than hiring supervisors who won't work to ensure compliance. Financial incentives tilt hugely in bankers' favor, wrote one economist after the 2008 crisis. By outwitting regulations, bankers can become unimaginably rich. To remedy this imbalance, some scholars have proposed linking their compensation to regulatory successes. Others that banks' shareholder liability should be altered to encourage more shareholder participation and supervision. But even as these scholars recognize the causal link between supervisor pay and shareholder incentives on one hand, and supervisory excellence and financial crisis prevention on the other, isn't as clean as it could be. Part of the problem afflicting bank supervision is also conceptual. We lack a clear theory of what bank supervisors are even supposed to do. In a world with long lists of Federal Reserve and state statutory compliance requirements, this theoretical confusion came to a head in 2014. Senate testimony, Senator Elizabeth Warren on the television today. The Massachusetts and New York Fed President William Dudley sparred about accusations the New York Fed had failed as a bank supervisor. In direct response, to the Segura hearings, there Dudley also articulated his conception of the role as a bank supervisor, disputing Senator Warren's view about the Fed needed to police bad behavior. Though the bank supervision, Dudley disputed the idea that the Fed as a banking regulator should be heavy enforcer of the banking laws. It is not like a cop on the beat, he said. It is more like a fire warden. Of course, every town needs both a fire warden and a cop on the beat if the Fed's conception of the bank supervision is dominated by the emergency response mentality. It is likely to be bad at the necessarily uncomfortable policing behavior. There are strong signs from the Yellen Fed that it views both of its roles, lender of last resort authority more like a fire warden, and the bank supervision more like O. Henry's cop on the beat, very seriously. But time will tell. There are no easy solutions to these difficult supervisory problems. From the perspective of understanding the space which within the Fed operates, though, there is something deeply problematic about the governance structure of the supervisory system. There is simply no theory offered that justifies the legal insulation of the Fed from a variety of political pressures. For example, in the form of the complete budgetary autonomy, the structure of the FOMC, Federal Operation Commission, I gotta look that up again. For bank supervision, what's worse than the bank supervision is not only an inherently executive function we would want to place within inherently executive bureaus. I was thinking bureaucratic. Bureaus such as the Treasury Department. It is also that the supervisory function is primarily lodged in the part of the Federal Reserve System with the greatest and most opaque, I want to say obliques, that's talking about working on the body, but opaque, hope that pronunciation is good, political power, the Federal Reserve Banks. The decision to locate bank supervision in the reserve banks doesn't reflect a considered balance between political accountability and technocratic expertise. It reflects path dependency and historical inertia. The role of reserve banks, either in their governance or their functions, is nowhere more suspect than in the bank supervisory roles. Next subject, financial stability and monetary policy. Related to but distinct from lender of last resort functions, bank regulation and bank supervision is the idea that the Fed has a mandate to preserve financial stability. As mentioned earlier, there is nothing new about the idea that the Fed should concern itself with financial stability. The thinking behind the extensive market assurances depending the Greenspan Fed, the so-called Greenspan put came from an impulse to provide the financial system with stability. Fucking thirsty. Stability. Even before the crisis, and scholars and central bankers have debated whether the Fed should or already does have a third mandate to provide financial stability. In that mandate, some scholars thought that monetary policy should be used to ensure financial stability by raising interest rates when it looked as though bubbles were forming in certain sectors of the economy. In this view, monetary policy and financial stability could be accomplished by the same instrument. the target interest rate. Here, once again, Ben Bernanke, the pre-crisis economist, was contributing to the academic debate about issues that Ben Bernanke, the post-crisis central banker, would live with every day. From Bernanke's perspective, the use of monetary policy to promote financial stability was wrong. His argument used the right tool for the right job. The idea that it could be the arbiter of security speculation or values was impossible, and because impossible, potentially catastrophic. Bernanke's argument was the interest rates as a blunt instrument. A central bank that moves its target interest rate can't focus on a specific asset classes while ignoring others. If there's a stock market bubble and the rise of the interest rates might help bring that bubble to a soft landing, like an airplane, there's no way, I made that up, to use the broad interest rate tools to focus just on the stock market. Student loans, mortgages, business loans, and all other credit throughout the economy will be affected in the same way. For this reason, Bernanke argued the monetary policy as a tool for financial stability was like trying to perform brain surgery with a sledgehammer. Instead, he thought financial stability is the best achieved through the Fed's banking toolkit, emergency lending and bank supervision and bank regulation. This debate rages on. The important point is to understand the theory behind placing financial stability functions on an identical institutional footing as the conduct of monetary policy. There is an easy answer to this. We can't. There isn't a theory that would give us both. Even if there were, it would fail because of the simple reality. The Fed is not an exclusive regulator charged with promoting financial stability in the U.S. government. The fractured nature of our system, both vertically between the state and federal governments and horizontally among various agencies at the federal level, is unrelenting. A perennial proposal would change this reality to improve horizontal division among federal regulators. Though presidents from both parties have sought to consolidate all bank supervisory and regulatory functions into a single entity, Mariner Eslis and Franklin Roosevelt made the unification of banking supervision a priority in 1944. In a memo from the Roosevelt to Eslis, the president expressed consternation at the duplication of triplication of bank examinations. Is this a rapping Federal Reserve book? By the Fed, the FDIC, and the comptroller of the currency, but nothing came of that effort, nor the many successive efforts by presidents of both parties to do the same. Most recently, Paul Volcker has made a similar proposal. I think the financial crisis has exposed just how rickety and out of date our supervisory framework is. He said, it's just a lousy system. Volcker has made a habit, he said, of asking various people if they think the system we have makes any sense. I haven't found anybody yet who says yes. Be it that as it may, not only has this continued, fuck the Federal Reserve. Not only has this idea gone nowhere, including because of the Greenspan Fed's efforts to block the Clinton administration's proposal along these lines. Instead, the federal regulatory system has gone in the other direction. Dodd-Frank introduced the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Financial Stability Oversight Council, adding more players in the regulatory mix. The FSOC especially will now require greater regulatory coordination, the shape of the Fed's regulatory space, the way that it makes policy for and by whom is more circumscribed by the invests of other regulatory actors than ever before. Volcker's specific proposal would be to leave the Fed in charge of systemic risk and bank regulation, the lender of last resort functions, but leave the examination and enforcement of bank supervision to separate entity that would have the authority of the scattered federal banking agencies currently in play. Whether dividing bank supervision from central banks is a good or bad idea, it is a perennial debate that empiricists have essentially been unable to answer. As one scholar recently described the nature of the involvement of a central bank in the supervision of financial firms and of infrastructure, motherfuckers, provides is a matter of endless controversy. It is probably incapable of an answer that is generally applicable at all times. It is in all places. And there are strong arguments that the central bank needs a hand in financial stability, even on a more individualized level, to ensure its ability to manage the financial system, especially in a financial crisis. Whether one comes down to one of these important debates, this entire conversation about both what the Fed should do with the financial stability, including whether it should be involved at all, is an important one for understanding why the Ulysses Punchbowl theory of Fed independence falls short. Because the financial stability mandate cannot be justified by the Ulysses Punchbowl model of the Fed independence, its inclusion under the same institutional umbrella confuses rather than clarifies the place of the Federal Reserve within government. In that Ulysses pronunciation, I've been hoping I've been doing that right, because I practiced pronouncing that for a while. And I just hope that it comes out. If not, you could go ahead and sound it out for yourself. Conclusion: Uber regulator of the economy. The Fed's movement from its role as a banker's bank and lender of the last resort to the god of the boom time economy, and back again. It's a stunning story of institutional change. The last two chapters have demonstrated that the Fed's authorities are many and varied, but also that our understanding of these authorities does not always match our view of what independent central banks should be. More particularly, the Ulysses Punchbowl view of the Fed independence is at its strongest when describing the conventional role of central banking, making technocratic decisions about controlling inflation, decisions that politicians are likely to be bad at making because of their electoral pressures. What the Ulysses Punchbowl view cannot describe is the appropriate level of insulation when the pressures are coming not to inflate the currency during the expansion, but to deflate the currency during a contraction. The 2008 financial crisis demonstrated that deflation or disinflation can still be a subject to the Fed to an extraordinary pressures to reverse course on ideological, not empirical basis. The sometimes inexplicable politics of monetary policy do not function as the Ulysses Punchbowl view would predict. This does not mean that political pressure on the Fed, less inflation, is evidence that the Fed has become politicized, as some have suggested. To the contrary, if there is a lack of political will to battle deflationary pressures and massive unemployment, and the consequences of this phenomena would be devastating. When an institutional shield against those political headwinds would be desirable. After all, in the terms of damage to society and economy, we should fear a Great Depression more than a great inflation. Note, though, the caveats, I'll go with that. Fiscal politics in the United States suggest that it is desirable to look for aid from an institutional beyond the floor of the House of Representatives to resolve vexing issues of macroeconomic policy. In these instances, the question is not purely technocratic, but the evaluation of competing value propositions that will otherwise be resolved by partisan politics. Here again, we all see that the role of the Fed is not to exercise technical expertise and to adjudicate between competing policy narratives. That is, the central banker looks less like a banker and more like a judge. The decision of dropping the gavel regarding the appropriate use of unconventional monetary policy instruments is the key decision, and that decision begins to look more like a judicial determination than a purely technocratic one. Cheers. The Fed's role as a bank regulator and supervisor requires even less insulation from politics than that. The political economy of these functions demonstrates this reality. As an emergency banker, the Fed worked hand in glove with the politicians during the crisis. As a regulator, the Fed must coordinate its activities with still more governmental figures. Invoking the name of the Fed independence to condemn or defend Fed actions in this space reveals how devoid of intellectual content the term independence, quotes, has become. This chapter and the previous chapter illustrate more than the difficulty that the standard account of the Fed independence has been explaining in the way the Fed actually works. They're also about how difficult it is invested in public to comprehend the Federal Reserve at all. The Fed's many functions, its confused governance, the difficulty in attributing what to whom within the Fed, these factors all demonstrate the problem. The massive functions within the Fed is a fighter of inflation, and deflation. The manager of the economic conditions of labor force, a banker, a bank supervisor, a financial regulator, and guarantor. It's spelled G-U-A-R-A-N-T-O-R. Fucking guarantor. Guarantor's Rex. Grantor. Let's just say it like that. G-R-A-N-T-O-R. Of financial stability makes the task of democratic accountability in any practical sense exceedingly difficult. Much of the controversy surrounding Fed policy comes from this inability to parse these distinct functions. That's the end of chapter 1 on part 3. Oh no, this is the last page of that chapter. Next is chapter 8. We're 55 minutes in, at least on my recording for YouTube. Don't worry, I'm not screen recording. I have 2 phones up. The sirens of the Federal Reserve. In the Ulysses Punch Bowl model of the Fed independence, the influence to watch on the outside is presidential. The politicians seeking re-election, who will stop at nothing to win. History certainly supports this view in part. Politicians do in fact care a lot about the Fed policy, but this aspect of the Ulysses Punch Bowl version of the Fed independence has 2 problems. It tells us a little about how these outsiders succeed or not at influencing Fed policy, and second, it tells us still less about who else besides the politicians will try to do the same. The reality is that there are many sirens trying to influence the Fed from the outside. Politicians are an important, but far from only voice in the mix. In the 3 chapters ahead, we will explore both the identities, the most important outsiders who influence the Fed policy, and the mechanisms by which they exercise that control. We begin with the president, the usual suspect for Fed influence, and move through Congress, international central bankers, private bankers, and markets, and the community of academic economists, as with much else in this book. The emphasis will be on how law and personality together and apart limit and facilitate outside, and I want to say excursions, but that's what I wish I was, an excursionist. But it says incursions with an I-N instead of an E-N. That's all I'm saying. It's 3:33 a.m. Welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. Okay, on the Fed's many missions. Chapter 8, the President and the Federal Reserve, the limits of law and the power of relationships. I'm saying, the government is necessarily at times possessed of large sums in cash. It is by far the richest corporation in this country, That's how they word it. Its annual revenue payable in money far surpasses that of any other body or person. Somebody. And if it begins to deposit this immense income as it occurs is what I want to say, but it's spelled like accurate. Fuck the pronunciation. Let's go. At any bank, I just got to get the information out. And once it becomes interested in the welfare of the bank, Walter Begot, 1873. We'll work on the wording later. We always got time to practice. There's time for everything. In the great political contest over the power of the economy, the president is the politician. We would expect to care most about what goes on within the Fed. The president is the only politician who faces a national electorate. Electorate. That's, you can pronounce it either way. Any member of Congress could always plausibly blame the president. Electorate. I'll just fucking say it. The president or any other party of the Fed itself is, if the economy sours in a way that could affect the legislator's own electoral prospects, avoiding blame is after all one of the primary motivators for electoral politicians. The president, like other politicians, has the same desire to take credit for the good and seek scapegoats for the bad. But unlike the others, the president has the hardest time avoiding that blame. And for all the strum and drang, I don't give a fuck who the president. The Fed needs to end. That is your president. Truth be known, little announced to everybody else. Check it out. The president has the hardest time avoiding that blame. And for all the strum and drang one hears through your eardrums during electoral cycles about values, foreign affairs, and so much else, it is largely the economy that makes or breaks. It is going to make or break you. An incumbent. You get it? Okay, I get it too. Fuck it. President. So, because electoral and legacy prospects depend in a large part on economic performance, it's natural. It's all natural. Every time. Never compromise your health. Go natural. Let me find my place again. I'll never rant on here. Fuck that. I changed my mind. The president is jealous of the power shared with the Fed. Again. I have a lot to gain. From Bagat. Given the awesome control over the gains in the gym, nations' finances that the Fed exercises, it is little surprise that the president should at once become interested in the welfare of that bank. And yet, most presidents since Woodrow Wilson have treated the Fed with at least some degree of hesitant distance. Carter Glass, that great defender of the first Federal Reserve System, 1913 through 35, once argued that the president had no role whatever in determining Fed policies. In his florid way, Glass argued that Wilson, a personal hero of his, recommended as a wise determination to refrain from executive interference with Federal Reserve administration and his refusal to permit politics to become a factor in any decision taking, unless the example thus set by President Woodrow Wilson, it just says Wilson there, one name, yo, shall be religiously adhered to. I'm trying to hear adhered, but you want to be adhered to. That's possibly not a word, but fuck it. To Glass further intone the system, which so far has proved a benediction to the nation, will be transformed into an utter curse. The political pack, regardless of party, whether barking in Congress or burrowing from high official station, shall be seductively, conducively, inconclusive, excluded. It says SEDULOUSLY. Y'all could say that one. But saying Sudafeds and the Sedula, that's how it is. And then Usely, go ahead and put that one together, yo. Fuck, where's my place? Regardless of the party, whether barking in Congress or burrowing from the high official station, will be seductively conclusive excluded. Despite the soaring rhetoric, Senator Glass frankly admitted that he himself, while serving as Wilson's Secretary of the Treasury and therefore chair of the Fed, indulged the temptation, break it down, to treat the Fed as a bureau of the Treasury. This tension between soaring aspect of the Fed independence and devilish temptation interfere with its policies constitutes much of the interaction between the president and the Fed. Here is where the inquiry, I don't fucking know, into the Fed's outside relationships begins. This literature is insane. Like, who is the author? Oh yeah, I forgot. I'll shout him out in the book again. I did last read. Peter Conti Brown. He raps in this Federal Reserve book. What can I say? I'm Chris Brown. We cannot understand the Fed without understanding how presidents negotiate its policy-making space, including where law limits and extends that influence. In this chapter, we start with the Federal Reserve Act and the formal legal influence that the act gives or withholds from the president. As with the rest of the book, the argument is not that the law is irrelevant, but that it is incomplete. The law matters here, but sometimes in counterintuitive ways. Fuck. Law is, of course, far from the only way. My battery's dying on a fast charger. That shit pisses me off sometimes. It's just directly into the wall, still dies. Fucking weak. Presidents engage in personal strategic behavior to shape that control constantly. Roughly 4 different modes of presidential influence over the Fed, primarily but not exclusively directed at the Fed chair, appointing Fed chairs and governors with identical policy outlooks, could be trusted to perform it as expected. As seen in the relationship between Franklin Roosevelt and Mariner Estes, the domination of Fed chair through regular pressure, as seen in the relationship between Richard Nixon and Arthur Burns, as a charm offensive whereby a president tailors his policy to suit the views of political popular Fed chair. As in the case of Bill Clinton and Alan Greenspan, the coincidence or coincidence, just plain, of policy preferences that arise in reaction to specific problems, as in this case of Barack Obama and Ben Bernanke, Hollywood, Hogan, NWO, Macho Man. The laws of presidential control. Before we get to the power of these personalities, we have to confront the legal context of the president's relationship to the Fed. Appointments to the Fed are the president's primary mechanism for exercising control. Despite the Fed's highly regarded independence, writes Kelly H. Chang, a political scientist who has studied the Fed appointments in depth, appointments remain an important avenue of political influence on monetary policy. What is fascinating though, for real, is how this influence occurs, not just on the pages of the Federal Reserve Act, but in practice. The fact that everyone works just to have freedom of travel, food, liberty, shelter, and a voice, that's slavery. Because it's unmanageable and it's forced labor. Because you die if you don't eat.